everyone, welcome back to Experts and Features podcast. As you know, this podcast is brought to you by Melbourne-based non-for-profit volunteer organisation, Global Health Youth Connecting, which is associated with the University of Melbourne.
As always, we want to acknowledge that the University of Melbourne City campus is located on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and welcome any First Nations listeners to the podcast.
I'll be chatting with Associate Professor Melissa Kang, who's worked with young people for over 20 years. She's a clinician, academic and advocate for adolescent and sexual health, and she's done a lot of work on understanding and improving healthcare for marginalised young people. She was also Dolly Doctor for 23 years. Young people from across Australia would send anonymous letters to Dolly magazine about anything from puberty to crushes, and Melissa's answers would be published in the magazine.
Ask us a question or suggest a topic for us to discuss by following our Instagram and Facebook account, or send us an email at sexualhealth.adolescents.health@GHYC.org.au. All links will be available in the description box below as always, or alternatively, you're welcome to leave a query in the comments section.
We hope this podcast series not only provides a safe space to discuss sensitive topics, but also raises awareness and empowers youth to be allies in this space. We would like to warn our listeners that we may discuss sensitive and triggering content such as mental health and sexual assault. Resources will be provided for those that may need to seek help or advice from professionals and organisation, as always in the description box below.
First of all, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I want to make the most of your time, so can we get straight into questions?
Sure, yeah.
So you received thousands of questions from young people as Dolly Doctor. What types of concerns consistently popped up?
I would have categorised them broadly into all the changes that happen during early to middle adolescence. In other words, the changes of puberty. And we tend to think about that as their bodies changing, and they were certainly a really significant proportion of letters. But it was also about feelings, emotions, relationships, and all the changes that happened in those areas of a young person's life. I would get lots of questions about height, weight, stretch marks, changing genitals, and things like increased facial and body hair, acne, all the kinds of things that happen to a young person's body as they go through puberty. But the other kind of big category of questions was around new sensations and feelings. So crushes on people, strong or intense romantic or sexual attractions, and also the experience of sexual arousal. So it is a new physical, physiological, biological sensation. We know that children can experience their own form of sexual play, sexual behaviours, and also feelings of physical pleasure. But the changes of puberty and the hormones do significantly alter the intensity and the quality of those physical sensations. So there would be a lot of questions about what this means, and particularly if a sensation like sexual arousal occurred in a context or in an environment that the young person felt was really weird or really didn't make sense to them. And then the other was around relationships, peers, also relationships with parents, negotiating boundaries, wanting to do things that their parents wouldn't let them, those kinds of things that happen during adolescence as well. So really broadly speaking, the letters to Dolly Doctor were very much about these multiple transitions and changes that were going on in a young person's life.
It's interesting that you say, I think you said the first category was kind of puberty and bodies. And I mean, at least in my sex education, I remember learning a lot about bodies and anatomy, but not so much about relationships. And I think especially not so much about sexual arousal, maybe because it's stigmatized in Australian society. Why do you think it's so stigmatized, and kind of what do you think we can do to make it easier to talk about things like sexual arousal?
Sexual arousal and sex in general with young people is this huge elephant in the room when it comes to sex education. And gosh, if you go to pre-pubertal children, it's even more taboo. So it's very hard to do research, in fact, or to really try to understand sexuality through the lifespan. We also marginalize older people, I have to say. You know, there hasn't been a lot of interest in the sexuality of older people. That's starting to change a little bit. But when we come to adolescence, because it's that phase of development where, in fact, it's completely normal, shall I say, natural for the majority of adolescents at some point during that decade. And it does vary enormously, but at some point during adolescence, if we call it between the age of 10 and 20, that there will be an emerging and developing interest in sex and sexual feelings, solo sex, if you like, self-stimulation, and certainly interactions and encounters with other people. I think that the reason it remains stigmatized is because of the concern about reproduction and babies. I think that's kind of been the driver of this over the millennia, and the concern about young people becoming pregnant, having babies when they're not ready, and what that will do to the rest of their lives. However, I think equally important is this kind of moral frame that we put around it. Somehow it's seen as immoral or just not okay to be really interested in sex if you're young, even though if you asked any adult in Australian society, I would think the majority would say that they also had these experiences and these feelings when they were adolescents. The people who do not fit into the cisgender heteronormative, model of sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity also experience discrimination, and they also have been marginalized over time in society. That is definitely changing for the better, but it's been a long road, and there's still a long way to go. I mean, we have marriage equality. We certainly have, I think, many young people who feel comfortable coming out during their school years, which was absolutely not the case a couple of generations ago. So there is progress and there is improvement. However, on the whole, people who don't fit into that cisgender heteronormative model still remain stigmatized and marginalized. So it's really hard because that develops largely during adolescence as well. That's another reason I think we try to shut it down. We pretend it doesn't exist, or we kind of place value judgments on it. So young people, regardless of whether they are even cisgender heterosexual young people, also are marginalized when it comes to sex as a result of actually being young. And that's something I've discovered in my own research, but it does appear in research over and over again that being young and being interested in sex is like this really taboo topic, even though most adults in Australia would go, yep, I can relate to that. I remember that when I was young. It's still something that we have difficulty talking about.
You mentioned when you were talking about the stigma, is there any difference and stigma and feelings of being ashamed? Is there any difference between what you see in boys versus girls?
Unfortunately, there is still. It's what I see in my day-to-day work, in my research, but also what I hear from others and read about in other people's research. It's quite alarming, really, that in 2021, that we are still seeing so much sexism and misogyny in society across the board, regardless of age. So that's, I guess, the starting point. When you have that as a pervasive attitude in our culture, not that everyone's like that, obviously, but when that's kind of this dominant attitude, obviously it's going to have this intensification and flow-on effect when you're young and sort of developing your sexuality and your sexual identity. There is still very much appears to be a double standard between men and women when it comes to sex. So what young people experience, what they've told me, is that it's still the case that if you're a male, an adolescent, let's say, who's embarking on the journey of discovering sex with other people, so not just by themselves, that they might stuff up, they might cheat, they might but nevertheless, they're sort of forgiven, it's accepted, it's kind of okay. Whereas if you do that as a female, or if you're too interested in sex, then you get labelled in disparaging ways. So that's a generalization, but that's what I continue to hear from young people all the time, that there's still this double standard. When it comes to what young people have been telling me recently, I've spoken to a few young people this year because of the issues around consent that have been so prominent in the media, that it's changing a little bit. So there's a much greater acceptance by young people of diverse genders and diverse sexualities. And young women, I would say, have told me that that's more acceptable now than still this notion that a cisgender heterosexual girl might really enjoy having lots of sexual partners or enjoying sex. So it's almost like that women and girls and being a heterosexual female is still one of the most is one of the most marginalized sort of groups of people. And that's kind of almost half of our young people population. Yeah. Now that's what I was going to say, that, it just kind of, makes me very depressed and blows me away. But I think we just have to keep working at it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't really thought about that point, that even though there's progress with in the LGBT and culturally diverse, among culturally diverse groups, it's still, I guess, lagging behind with women. On the point of marginalization and how you said that it's young people just as a general group are marginalized. For sexual health education and sexual health care, probably all young people find it challenging to access it, but there's some groups that find it especially challenging, such as low socioeconomic background, if you have a diverse cultural linguistic background, if you're from a rural area or part of the LGBTQI community. Can you describe some of the ways that it's more challenging for different groups of young people to access sexual health care and health education?
Sure. Well, as you say, young people on the whole, particularly those under 18, I think, but even those perhaps in their early adulthood where they're, legally able to go out and drink and perhaps, do more, they're still kind of, looked down upon. They're still seen as, they still have difficulty perhaps accessing healthcare. And some of that's to do with not really understanding how the health system works. The cost of healthcare, which has gone up, the gap payment. So there are lots of hidden costs when you access healthcare. It might be free to perhaps go see a GP, but not then to go and purchase your prescription or go to see the person that your GP refers you to. So there are plenty of costs in healthcare that many, many young people experience, regardless of their background or whether they're kind of from a more marginalized group. However, the groups that you've mentioned, so one thing is around health literacy in general. So understanding, particularly when it comes to sexual and reproductive health, having access to accurate, value-neutral, non-judgmental information about sexuality, sexual and reproductive health broadly. So if you're, from a very disadvantaged family, community, where even being able to get to school regularly and get support with your studies is challenged, then that can obviously have an impact on your overall health literacy. If you're from a culturally, linguistically diverse group, it might not be so much language challenges if you're an adolescent who's learning English or has learned English pretty well, but it might be to do with attitudes, or it might be to do with the fact that information that's out there doesn't really target your ideas and your understandings of the world. Young people in rural and remote areas have told us that, and it's highly variable, but sometimes services they need are just not available. So, and particularly if it's something sensitive like sexual and reproductive health, there might be not enough health services in the community. There might just be one or two sort of general practices, and that can make it a bit difficult to feel like you've got privacy or confidentiality. And certainly some services might just not be there. When it's, say, for reproductive health, for example, perhaps services around termination of pregnancy or pregnancy counselling might just not exist. And young people of diverse sexualities or gender identities experience that kind of marginalisation across the board. but it might be more visible in a smaller community. So in a rural or regional, remote sort of area, it might be even harder because they're more visible and want to be more hidden. But have told us that they experience discrimination across the board in different health settings. It's variable, and there's absolutely excellent health professionals and services for all the groups that we're talking about. But as a generalization, these are some of the issues that come up.
On the point about health literacy, now that young people have access to the internet, do you have any advice for them on how to kind of navigate just this insane amount of information and also deal with pornography and kind of bad models of sexuality? And
well, in some ways, technology has been really fantastic for young people, because the stuff that their parents or their teachers or the adults in their lives wouldn't tell them, they can actually probably go and find it somewhere on the internet. The downside, of course, is, as we know, that the sex education, in inverted commas, that occurs on the internet, and there's plenty of good stuff there, tends to perhaps draw you into pockets of information that aren't particularly comprehensive, aren't particularly helpful. So we know from, I think, fairly recent studies that look at the age at which young people first come across online pornography is getting lower and lower. And sometimes even well before their bodies are even ready to be having sex. So the kind of images that they're seeing through online porn tend to be fairly stereotypical and fairly narrow. And if that's because visual images are so powerful, more powerful than written text. If you could go to a website that had really good information, but you then see a video of two people having sex through pornography, that's a much more powerful image that will stick with you. So that's the problem partly there, is that, pornography sits there as a default sex educator when young people really want to know. I mean, the questions I would get for Dolly Doctor would be, what is a blowjob? How do you actually have, and that, penis in vagina sex, for example, what's actually involved? They want to know the mechanics of it, as well as understand the context and the feelings and the negotiations around that. So we don't have a kind of sensible equivalent to what they see on porn. And that's not to say that, pornography is not all this terrible bad thing. There's, it's entertainment. It has lots of, and always has existed in society. But the problem is that I think, from what I understand from reading the research and talking to experts who've studied this, is that the porn that's available for free online tends to draw young people into these very stereotypical and body image stuff and genital body image. They see these very stereotypical impressions and expressions of sex and sexuality. But the internet is nevertheless full of great stuff that's really useful and very educative and very informative. Young people, we know, are actually pretty savvy at understanding what's sound, credible advice and what isn't. If we think about some of the conspiracy theories that are out there with COVID, for example, the young people I talk to, on the whole, they can discern the difference. They can figure it out, even when they're quite young. And we know from research that I've been involved in that they recognize, they trust websites that are about, that are produced by government departments or that have university or sort of experts behind them. They can figure that out. However, they find the information that's presented quite dull, quite hard to sort of get through, because I think that's sort of the nature sometimes of particularly government websites. They tend to put lots and lots of information there, not perhaps very much visual stuff. So, and the other area, of course, is social media. And that's something that's very hard to regulate, very hard to kind of know what's being generated, because it's produced by everybody. And young people, again, they can discern and they tend not to trust what they see on social media as much as what they do from, say, a website. But social media is much more engaging. So, there are people who work in health promotion, in health generally, who try to tap into social media and send messages through that way. But that's fine. That's all very useful. But I guess it's the vastness, the kind of infiniteness of social media and the internet that makes it really difficult to kind of find your way. And I don't have an easy answer. I think it's all about, again, from a very young age, through school-based education, but also through families and parents and carers, is to teach young people and children health literacy and media literacy and social media literacy. So one message I say to parents to perhaps talk to their children about, if they're concerned about pornography, for example, is to say, well, it's like watching a movie or a show on Netflix or your streaming service. It's acting, it's fake, it's not real. And the trouble is that images are so powerful, and so even though you kind of intellectually know that it's fake, it nevertheless does probably, particularly if it generates a kind of arousal response, it's going to sort of probably stick in your memory somehow for longer. So that's a very long answer to your question. I hope I've covered that. Yeah.
I love the point about young people actually being really good and perhaps better than adults because they've grown up with these technologies, and that we should recognize that in some aspects they're ahead of adults.
Very much so. And one thing I've always pushed for in my work, in my research, going back over 25 or more years, is that we have to partner with young people, as much as we can at every step of the way, if that's feasible, if it's possible to do that, whether it's research, whether it's developing materials, literacy materials, particularly around sexual and reproductive health, or whether it's giving advice on a government committee that's about young people and about their health and well-being. We have to include them, and ideally, co-produce information with them. At the very least, consult with them and bring them in as experts. But ideally, co-create, co-design, and co-produce. I think, again, there's a movement towards that, but nevertheless, it's not universal, and it should be.
I'm sorry we've gone over time. I don't want to keep you much longer. I just have one final question before we go.
Sure.
If you could go back in time, what's one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self about sexual and adolescent health?
Would be that what I feel and how I see myself is absolutely okay. I think it would be that. I mean, I think most adolescents, and certainly this was true for me, do feel very self-conscious. And of course, I also was I am from a mixed race background, and I had recently moved to Australia and sounded a bit funny, had a funny accent. So that, on top of being female and not fitting into the kind of typical Anglo-Australian mold, I think those things do affect you. But it wasn't so much that. It was more to do with, gosh, I'm quite interested in what there is to know about sex and relationships, but it was the sort of thing you couldn't talk about. So I think I would tell myself, this is normal. This is really healthy and fine to be wondering and asking questions like this. I mean, I didn't have many places to go to look for that information, but it's important to know that it's really healthy to have curiosity about sex and relationships. Yes, I think that would be it. It's not only normal, it's actually really healthy to be curious about sex when you're young.
That's awesome.
And it's also fine if you're not. So, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for all your answers today. I think they're going to be amazing.
I'm so pleased about your project. Great stuff you're doing, and all the best with it.
Thank you so much.
Okay. See you later.
Hi everyone. I hope you are enjoying the Eggplants and Peaches podcast. I'm here to tell you about another podcast called Youthology, Navigating Life as a Youth. This podcast is hosted by me, Inda Johannes, and is all about the issues, experiences and fun that is experienced by youth. I talk about a range of topics and have special guests and friends joining me for some episodes. Listen now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts and more. I hope to have you join me soon.